This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Daniel B. Rodriguez, who is Dean and Harold Washington Professor at Northwestern Law School. Dean Rodriguez recently completed his term as the 2014 President of the Association of American Law Schools. Dean Rodriguez is the 2015 Jefferson Lecturer at Berkeley. Dan, welcome to Berkeley.
Glad to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born about 500 miles south of here, Long Beach, California, a little bit south of Los Angeles.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in a lower to middle class family and not a particularly academic family. Nonetheless, they encouraged me in my own academic pursuits. And if I had to summarize it, I would say that they taught me the value of hard work and persistence. And so again, even though academic life was remote from their own experience, they were very proud of me and encouraged me in a really to really work hard and to aspire.
And when did the idea of possibly pursuing the law, did it germinate with the family, or did that come later?
It came much later. My own experience was a little unusual. I came out of high school with no particular aspirations to go to college, quite frankly, and began in community college in Long Beach, and went from there to California State University at Long Beach. And for basically 4/5 of my time at Long Beach State, I worked full-time and went to school at night. So I was happy being there and worked hard, but didn't have a particular aspiration for graduate school, much less law school. And if I had to source it, I would say it was fairly late in my time at Long Beach State, where the idea was planted to go to law school. I really enjoyed studying the subjects, political science, economics, and I thought law school would be a great aspiration. But it was a bit of a lark, quite frankly, to apply to law school at the time.
And going back to your earlier education, did you have mentors that really pushed you along with the importance of education in the way your parents had?
Yes, I had a number of mentors at Long Beach State. Now, again, I wouldn't diminish them by saying that they didn't contribute a lot to my development of my ideas. I wouldn't look back and say, oh, that professor or this professor really gave me a way of shaping my looking at the world. But on the other hand, they encouraged me greatly to aspire to go to get additional education. And so it was really the confidence that I built from my time at Long Beach State that gave me the confidence that I knew that I could really thrive in a graduate school, law school environment.
And where did you go to law school?
I went to law school at Harvard Law School.
And at Harvard, what attracted you in the subfields of law?
Well, so I loved law school, I confess, and particularly in my first year, which in law school, which is a 3-year program, is really your core year. It's the subjects that I studied and we studied at Harvard were very much like the subjects that law students would study 100 years ago. It was really a core knowledge. So my first year was really devoted to developing really a background and a base of knowledge and way of thinking, what we sometimes call thinking like a lawyer. It was really only when I got near the end of my law school career and was taking more elective subjects and working with some terrific faculty members that I really started to develop and nurture my interest in public law, which in a nutshell is really about the relationship between law and the government, about governance in the United States. And so the courses that I took, papers that I was doing, my work on the law review really kind of gelled to develop my intellectual and academic interest in law.
And so what your interest came to be defined in the research you later pursued, sort of emphasized the the dynamic of federalism on the one hand, the relationship of local government and state government, but also the way it's embedded in the politics of the time.
Well, you put it very well, and would that I had such a clearly defined research agenda in law school. I certainly didn't. But certainly, and that came later, but certainly that describes very well what I was mostly taken with when I was in law school, what interested in me. So I did my, what is essentially my master's thesis, my what they call the third-year paper on federalism and the Republican tradition. And so some of the themes that you just mentioned, and really about the relationship among structures of government and national, state, and local governments, and just really how we govern ourselves in a free society, really again grew out of my my intellectual interest. When I look back, by the way, on what I wrote in law school, it's remarkably callow and naive, I have to say, but it really the germs of what became my sort of academic projects when I joined the faculty here.
And this must be a fertile time for that kind of research, because the balance seems to be tipping away from the central government and back to the states. Is that a fair assessment?
It's an absolutely fair assessment. When I was coming out of law school and really was beginning my academic career, on the one hand, it was then a fertile time because many of these issues, of course, were very prominent in American politics. On the other hand, they weren't particularly fertile in American law. To make a long story short, the United States Supreme Court had mostly absented themselves, really ever since the New Deal, from major disputes involving the relationship between the state and national governments. You could count on one hand the number of blockbuster Supreme Court decisions on that topic. And moreover, local government law, while very important to a handful of distinguished political scientists, including some at this wonderful university, was not something that was high on the priority list of academics. And in fact, if I could tell you just a short story, when I came to the dean of this law school when I was a pre-tenured faculty member, I said I really wanted to teach a course in state and local government law. And he sort of looked at me and said, you know, we don't do that sort of thing here at Berkeley. We're a national law school, and you might want to leave that until after you get tenure. That was sort of the status of that subject in American law schools when I began my academic career.
And what drew you to the subject? Was it anything in your background, or was it just you saw it as a fallow field?
You know, it was really the latter. As I started to really bear down on very important issues of governance, read the literature, and look at what was going on in the world in which I was living, particularly in a place like California, Northern California, I always came back to the phenomenon of state and local governments, and particularly how important and critical were issues of governance at the local level. There was, as you probably recall, quite a lot of conversation about regionalism and regional governance, particularly in this part of the world where you have so many counties sort of engaged and colliding in issues. There were, you know, so many fertile topics of study, but at the same time, not that many law professors, not that many public law scholars who were really, really looking closely at issues of state governance and local governance. There was a sense that there's not a lot in it for them, and none of us really wanted to be specialists in, say, California law or Massachusetts law. So I saw this area as an area of enormous interest and quite a lot of fertile topics.
And since you were in law school, the time has come for that agenda, really, in a very pronounced way, as we see, for example, with Obamacare, where, you know, all the arguments are about the relationship to the state and what for example, with regard to the exchanges. Sure. And whether there should be national exchanges if there are no state exchanges. Well,
there's no question about that. I mentioned a moment ago that it wasn't, when I began my academic career, an extremely active time in the adjudication, in the judicial process in federalism. Well, that changed quite a bit. It really changed in large part due to the innovations of the so-called Rehnquist Court. So there was, over the past really 2 decades, a greater amount of attention on the part of the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court, on issues of federalism. At the same time, and you mentioned Obamacare, the last really 3 or 4 presidential administrations have brought a number of just fascinating, interesting, novel experiments with regard to the relationship among the state and federal government, but also with regard to the relationship between Congress and the presidency. So you have 2 fascinating sort of clusters of activities colliding: the greater innovation and work done in the political branches, in the political process, but also a greater amount of attention on the part of the Supreme Court in these particular issues.
Did your background in political science or whatever continuing interest you have in politics inform your legal research?
You know, the answer is yes, but in a little incongruous way. So again, my own experience in college is how I've described it. My experience in law school is as a hardworking law student. But it really began when I began my academic career here at Berkeley. And I had the wonderful opportunity to learn from and study with a number of colleagues, both within the law school here at Bolt Hall, but also a little more indirectly with some terrific political scientists. The role, just for example, of the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Berkeley was very important on me. Unlike law professors these days, who tend to come to law teaching careers with another advanced degree, that's by far the most common sort of professional. I didn't. So I came here really, in some sense, not being excessively humble, with no particular business being a tenure track faculty member. I didn't have another graduate degree. So much of my education was, as they say, on-the-job training. So my first few years here at Berkeley really developed a very strong interest in, and I think a lot of training in political science, some amount of political theory, economics that really helped burnish my academic skills.
And so, in a way, the challenges you confronted as an individual are comparable to the challenges you confront as a law school dean in rethinking law school curriculum.
You know, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but that's really, I find that quite insightful. I wouldn't have thought about that at the time as I began my administrative career, but I actually, yes, in short, I think I brought both my training and my perspectives as a on-the-job trainer in these to my administrative career.
I like to ask my guests about the skills and temperament that are part of the profession or career that you've chosen. And I know that that's changing, but let's talk about the time when you were a student, and then we'll move to how that might be changing. So what are the skills that in your day were seen as important for a law student?
Well, certainly an enormous amount of energy and attention to the study and to that process. My experience at Harvard, and I have no reason to believe it would be different at the other great American law schools, was not exactly the paper chase, if you recall that, but it was not long after that. There was a hierarchy, and there was an expectation that we were there to study and learn the law through the Socratic method and through really old techniques. Rigor was very important. We felt like we knew a lot from our undergraduate careers, and we were all very smart and did well on tests. But the expectations that the faculty had for us as law students in terms of rigor and explaining our arguments and analyzing was really absolutely critical. For some of us, not so much myself, but some of us, we came into law school with an enormous experience in that regard. For others, we developed that while we were in law school. So I would say to have a sense of just rigor and care in not only in the study, but in expression. We like to say in the practice of American law that the importance, particularly in the United States, of written communication is absolutely critical. We watch on television, the Perry Masons or the Law and Orders or the somebody arguing for the Supreme Court, and you get the sense that we're all a bunch of junior Daniel Websters. But the reality is, the bottom line is most of the practice of law and most of the process of advocacy comes through written expression. So the ability to develop the skills to express yourself in written form is absolutely critical for a law student.
What about temperament?
This might be a somewhat surprising answer, but I think humility is a big part of it. I think as the old saying goes, knowing what you don't know, which in the study of law and the practice of law is a good deal, to put it mildly. So having the temperament in which you have the kind of modesty or humility. I'll give you an example. One of the distinguished graduates of the law school that I'm the dean of is a man who's argued more Supreme Court cases than any living lawyer, nearly 80. And so I asked him one time, there's nothing you don't know. You've practiced before the Supreme Court nearly 80 times. It must be so, you must be so used to it. And the answer he gave was really surprising. Is that he says, I have humility every single time. Not fear, but humility in terms of the temperament that I bring to the process. So I think that among the many lists of skills that I think great law students and lawyers have, having that sense of self-confidence on the one hand, but a lack of hubris is a big part of that temperament.
One of the things that I want to talk to you about is being dean and the transformations that are occurring in the legal profession and in law schools. But before we get to that, I want to ask something about being a lawyer as a cultural icon in the era when you did your training. And by that I mean that on the one hand, the Perry Mason, the Clarence Darrow, the Louis Brandeis, the Felix Frankfurter were seen as people who one could emulate to the extent that you actually wanted to be them or be one of the cohort that they were part of. So that's one thing.
Sure.
The other thing, a lawyer, and this was less known, was in training to go to law school, you were becoming part of a guild, almost a medieval guild, in the sense that you were trained to learn a craft, and the guild limited the number of people who were in the guild. And then thirdly, law, and I'm not trying to make a speech here, but I think it's very...
I'm following. This is very helpful.
But okay, the law as a career was a default choice for many students. I don't know what I want to do, so I'll become a lawyer. So talk a little about those three strands, especially in your time when you were in law school, because that's changing.
So it's a wonderful way to capture it. So let me touch on all three, because I think they all come together, and indeed it's a wonderful segue to the challenges we're facing right now in the practice in legal education. So as to the first, yes, we put, as I came to the law school, myself and my classmates, lawyers on an enormous pedestal. Now, quite frankly, some of that might have to do with going to Harvard. But where there's such a sort of distinguished careers of these extraordinary graduates whose busts you saw as you came to school, but it really captured in the faculty and the curriculum this sense that we were entering into a noble profession, and that maybe we would have as part of our careers arguing before the Supreme Court. Now, I will say that was an aspiration for a number of my classmates. Elena Kagan was a classmate of mine, and a number of others. So there was a sense that we could really aspire to greatness. But the bottom line is, we saw the legal profession as an extraordinary and enormously important calling, and also with a real sense of responsibility. Now, you mentioned the guild, and that's also had and has a powerful force on how we think about the legal profession. And the contrast that I would draw, if I may, is between entering the guild of being a lawyer or entering the guild of being a doctor versus entering into a profession, say, as a business person or others, where you don't really need a particular credential in order to be part of that. So the notion behind entering this guild, which is of course a long-standing tradition, is that you had to go to law school, not just be educated in the law. You had to go to law school, and law school had to look like a particular thing. 3-year program with a set curriculum, taking a bar examination after you graduate, all of that led to being part of a club, you might say, a guild. And while that was probably becoming anachronistic even when I was in law school, we didn't have that sense. And our faculty at Harvard really gave us a sense that they were giving us the training that enabled us to be part of this extraordinary club, sort of secret knowledge or information. The last point that you touched on, which is the sort of the default issue, is a really powerful one as well. By contrast to going to medical school, for example, where there's an enormous amount of training and scaffolding that goes into building your background to go to medical school, you can sort of fall into law school. Take a law school admissions test, do well in college. And so there was a sense that among the tens of thousands of law students who were going to, at the time, the 160 or so United States law schools, only a handful well, maybe more than a handful, not a majority, were folks that really aspired to go to law school because they loved studying the law, or really aspired to become a lawyer because they saw it as a great calling. So in some sense, it's one of the deficits of the fact that anyone can go to law school, or nearly anyone can go to law school, in that there's not a lot of background sorting that really gives one a sense of what kind of career or study they're entering into.
Before we talk about the challenges of a dean, let's talk about being a dean. What are the skills and temperament that you think need to be present if one, as a lawyer, is also going to be dean of a law school?
Sure. Well, so let me get at that answer by beginning with what is, I think, hopefully a short sentence of what the job entails. So there's all these different parts, and you could answer that question by aggregating all the things that I do in the course of my day. But the real summary is you're really looking at sort of 360 degrees of the entirety of the law school as an organization. Very much unlike what you do as a law professor, or as a law student, or really any other constituency group. You are responsible, I'm responsible for the overall management, organization, and leadership of a medium-sized organization. I don't do it alone, and Lord knows I call upon an extraordinarily able administration. All of that's true, but I have to have and am responsible for having the big picture. So to the skill set, certainly some of the obvious answers to that question is organizational skills, a sense of some financial literacy, since I'm, after all, managing a fairly large budget. All of those skills are important. Being a people person, if I can use that phrase in terms of interaction. But I would dig just a little bit deeper and say that one of the skill sets that's absolutely important is a sense of appreciation for the diversity and the breadth of what we do in our particular schools. You have to be, or you ought to be, as a dean, to have not only a knowledge of, but an appreciation for the work of the faculty, the way in which faculty members balance teaching and research, for the aspirations and objectives and goals of your law students and understanding what they're going through. You certainly have to have an appreciation for the diversity and breadth of experience of your alumni, not only because you're often in a position of asking them for financial donations, which we are, but also you're really trying to capture what their experiences were in your law school, whether they graduated 1 year ago or 50 years ago. And that requires, I think, the kind of breadth of experience that, quite frankly, you don't pick up in law school, or even as a tenured member of a law school faculty.
Where did your organizational background come from? Was this something you picked up in the course of your education, or is it something that comes naturally? Well,
certainly it doesn't come naturally. In all candor, I picked up whatever skills I developed in terms of organizational ability, I began developing after I was named as dean, which is certainly not optimal. You have to understand that I became dean, entered what in many respects is the second part of my career as an academic administrator, when I was 34 years old, when I'd been on the faculty here at Berkeley for 10 years, without any particular knowable skill set that would have trained me to be an academic administrator. I'd never been an associate dean, for example. I'm not trying to be excessively humble, saying I didn't have skills, right, but I didn't know whether I would have the kind of skill set that would enable me to lead a law school until I began as dean at the University of San Diego.
So in a way, as dean, you mentioned some of the constituencies that you have. So the political management of those constituencies, and I don't use political I use it in a positive sense, yes, not in a pejorative sense. And in addition, I guess other elements of the constituency are law firms,
sure,
state government, and the Bar Association, the managers of the
all of those,
yeah, all of those
not
things.
to mention your university setting,
right,
because as one dean, maybe of a law school, maybe someone else put it, we're a number of things simultaneously, and one is we're middle-level managers, right? We're not the provost and we're not the chancellor or the president. That's not to say that we don't have an extraordinary realm of influence or even power over our institutions, but we also have to navigate, to come back to a federalism theme, if I may, vertical relationships in addition to horizontal relationships.
So in these times, there are numerous challenges that law schools are facing. So managing the transition in a time of great change is important additional component of one's leadership as a dean. Let's talk about these various constituencies and how kind of they're changing in what their expectations are of law school. And in one of your blog posts, you mentioned the problems being posed by state government in a way, in terms of at a time when you're trying to rethink the curriculum, states of New York and California are saying, well, you should do this, or you should do. Talk a little about that, because that's an important challenge.
Well, I'm glad you raised it. It's very much on my mind, and indeed it's on the mind of a number of law school deans and leaders. There's a real paradox going on, or a real puzzle, you might say. And I think you described it well. On the one hand, this is a period of time in which law schools are going through an enormous amount of innovation, or needing to go through a lot of innovation. They're innovating in terms of the curriculum, developing new modalities of legal education, new techniques of legal education, not unlike other parts of the university, the role of technology in how we teach, the significant role of experiential learning to try to sort of navigate the twin challenges of developing more interdisciplinary education, which is vitally important to the practice of law on the one hand, but on the other, developing the kind of skill set that enables our students to become practice proficient when the time they graduate, and any number of other innovations. So there's a lot, suffice to say, there's a lot going on. But in order to, and at the same time, and this is a very important point, at the same time, the costs of legal education have become astronomical. So all of us in American law schools, even those of us who have the privilege to lead elite American law schools, have to be conscious of the high costs. So the challenges are very acute, and a number of law schools, and indeed I think the majority of law schools, are rising to that challenge and are developing quite a lot of innovations. Now, at the same time, one of our constituency groups, very important that you mentioned, which is the state bar associations and state government, have in mind what, from my perspective, and I think from many perspectives, are a truncated and in many respects fairly narrow view of the obligations and the responsibilities of a law school. And one of the ways in which they're manifest, as I've written about and spoken about, is the development of additional core curricula that they are looking to insist upon at law schools within their states. Now, let's be clear, they have the right to do that. This is not an issue of prerogative or freedom of law schools to do whatever they do. Our law schools are accredited by the American Bar Association. The students have a law degree, can sit for the state bar. So it's within the prerogative of the state judiciaries or the state bar associations to not only cajole law schools, but to even impose requirements. The problem, though, is the imposition of these very specific sort of practice-oriented legal requirements impose significant costs and burdens on law schools, again, at a time in which law schools are needing to economize. And they also are trying to develop and aspire to develop sort of a one-size-fits-all paradigm on law schools, frustratingly, just at the time that law schools are innovating in important ways to catch up to the realities of legal practice. So these dilemmas collide and create an enormous amount of burdens on law schools. And no one should weep about the dilemma of law school deans. The burdens that they impose on law schools are, of course, burdens they impose on law students and the ability of law schools to really educate law students for a very dynamic new economy.
Well, does this become a problem of political education in a sense? In other words, the ability to communicate with these various constituencies and say, hey, I hear what you're asking for, but we've got other pressures and you need to take that into account.
It's a great point, and I would even broaden the point to say this, to bring it back to us, because what I've just said sort of seems to put the blame, as it were, on these other constituency groups. But let's face the law school's responsibility. We have conducted ourselves in American legal education for decades now with a sense of, leave us alone, we know what's best, we'll develop our curriculum, we'll hire a faculty, we'll develop our mission, and you guys just sort of stay out of things. And so, once the law schools are accredited by the American Bar Association, which is not that burdensome of a process, we've mostly lived in our ivory towers. So one of the fundamental problems with that is we have not done a very good job over the course of the last many years in communicating to these constituency groups why we're innovating, what we're doing to innovate, and what our missions are. So we're now in a very difficult political position. You mentioned political, I think it's the right way to put it, where we're sort of scrambling to articulate a vision of what law schools are looking to do, when it might be, if not too late, then sort of in the fourth quarter, if I could use a football analogy, of this debate. Then we're in a position, again, and I think political is the right way to describe it, of seeming defensive, seeming antagonistic, and seeming condescending to a number of well-meaning lawyers and judges who have been working to engage in a dialogue with law schools for a great many years. So I would just say that we need to engage in a dialogue, not push back in the sense of basically saying, leave us alone to do what we've been doing for a number of decades, but engage in a certain mea culpa at the level of dialogue, and engage these stakeholders in a very important conversation about, frankly, what the future of legal education is going to be like in the coming years.
In 2012, I guess the ABA, the Bar Association, did a report on law schools. And
they did.
I was reading an account of that and of their conclusions, and one struck me, which was, well, you might think about not having tenure in law schools. Now, that strikes me as one of those recommendations that really, in the context of a university and its governance, is not very practical.
Right. Well, there's two ways to one doesn't want to overread that sentence, which comes in the context of, as you know, if you read it, an omnibus report that sort of throws out a number of ideas. There was another part of that report that says, law professors shouldn't think that much about prestige. There's another, law school should innovate more. So one way to understand that is a little bit of it's kind of a bomb throwing line, you might say, but of a bit of a maybe you should think about that. The other way to think about it, though, is in a more alarmist sense, which is what they're really urging upon law schools, the vast majority of which are part of universities, is really to abandon this extraordinary device that, of course, has been part of universities, if not forever, then for quite a bit of time. That, of course, that reading presents an enormous amount of controversy. I will just say this on the larger issue. There's two very different dimensions of this debate about job security and tenure for law professors. One dimension that you just touched on is whether it's a good idea for law schools to have essentially tenure or tenure-like protections for their full-time faculty. That's a larger topic. I'll just say as a sentence, I think it is a good idea, and I think law schools have developed as part of universities, extraordinary abilities in no small part because of having a full-time faculty that's doing teaching and research. But I'll say the other dimension of that is a very different one, and that is not so much a counseling to law schools to give up on tenure, but actually an exhortation to the ABA in accrediting law schools, the American Bar Association, not to require tenure. And that's more of an argument about innovation. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. That is, let law schools experiment with different modalities of organization. And if a law school wants to develop a paradigm of different kinds of teaching, maybe relying upon practicing lawyers or adjunct faculty, or maybe having term contracts or other sorts of devices, maybe that would be a good thing to try out. I'm much more sympathetic, I should say, to that paradigm, because that really gives us a sense of the marketplace of ideas and marketplace of innovation, which I'm quite sympathetic to.
So it becomes important for all the players to, on the one hand, understand the problems of particular constituencies, but on the other hand, be open to innovation wherever it's coming from. One of the other challenges, I mentioned law firms. There seems to be quite an amazing transformation occurring within firms, their hiring practices, the whole nature of of partnership and the building of an entrenched hierarchy within firms where the people at the very top who've been in the firm a long time are doing quite well, but this may not be true of the younger lawyers.
That's exactly right. There's extraordinary changes, a wide amount of changes going on in our great American law firms. And as in so many respects, law schools are just catching up to those changes. And without providing a bullet point list, the role of technology has transformed law schools, law firms in important ways, and reduced sort of the need for the kind of labor force that was so characteristic of these law firms in the old firm, where you'd have sort of a pyramid of law firm partners at the top and this large army of associates doing this extraordinary amount of work. Clients are pushing back against law firms assigning first or second year associates who might bill at $500 or more an hour to work on their particular cases. So as a consequence, law firms are hiring fewer law firm associates. There are issues of work-life balance, where a number of lawyers, male and female, are asking themselves, now explain to me why I'm spending 10 years at the prime of my life working like a dog with a fairly remote chance of being a partner. Globalization has had enormous impact. So these and other challenges are changing the structure of American law firms in very significant ways. One of the most profound impacts on law schools and legal education is quite simply fewer positions as law firm associates, and thus fewer positions with significant remuneration for law students who are coming out of law school with extraordinary amount of debt. The larger question of whether those law firms will be permanently transformed and the whole business model of the large American or worldwide law firm will change, too soon to tell. But I think the direction is very much toward fundamental structural rather than cyclical change in terms of the practice of law.
So does this mean that you, as a dean, that you tinker with the curriculum but not make any drastic change until you are sure that the environment out there has really changed?
Well, as a pundit once said, a politician, I think, where you stand depends on where you sit. And that's true of American law schools. So I think the challenge, there's about 200 ABA accredited law schools, and there's of course quite a pecking order of American law schools. Only a fraction of those 200 law schools send a significant critical mass of their students to the largest law firms in the United States. It doesn't mean that the other law schools should go out of business, far from it. It just means the vast majority of American law schools produce graduates who go to smaller law firms, maybe solo practitioners go into the public sector. So part of the challenge is whether you tinker with the curriculum, whether you develop different modalities of instruction, depends on where you are in that ambit. So to bring it back to my law school or this law school here at Berkeley, of which I was a part, where we do send so many of our students to large law firms, yes, we tinker or even make more substantial changes to our law school curriculum. If I had to say what the major innovation that the nation's great law schools are doing, including mine, it's developing more interdisciplinary training and multidisciplinary training. And what does that mean in practice? It means developing the kinds of skills in our students so they can pivot and be flexible in terms of developing their skill set and their careers. So yes, all the traditional body of knowledge, the kind of information they need to be practicing lawyers from day one, yes, but also the development of business skills, the development exposure to technology, the ability to read a spreadsheet, to know something about coding, to know something about international initiatives. There's just different kinds of skills than the kinds of skills that my law school, when I went to law school, really thought that it was responsible for in training its law students.
So a law student might have to be thinking about, well, I'm not going to be in a law firm. I may actually be in a startup
Yes.
or a number of startups advising them about patent infringements or the legality. Well, think of Uber
Yep.
and Lyft, that essentially, well, what are the local rules that apply to taxi cabs that we're going to have to become involved in?
Well, that's exactly right, and it's even more daunting than that, because what a law student now has to think of is, I may be entering a profession in which I need to know now that I'm developing the kind of skills to enter into an economy that will change rapidly over the course of my first 10 or 20 years of the profession in ways that I can't expect or predict. Technology will change in important ways that will change the nature of the practice. The economic model of legal practice will change. I may not even be a so-called practicing lawyer 10 years from now. I may be a C-suite executive, or I may be an entrepreneur, or I might be working in a university setting. So there's always been uncertainty, right? No one can predict their entire careers when they look at it ex ante. But the kind of uncertainty and turbulence that's happening in the profession now is so striking that it requires an enormous amount of self-confidence and also sort of risk-taking behavior on the part of law students now to know what they need to develop the skills that will enable them to thrive in the new economy.
When one thinks of university curriculums, they're often unwilling to accept change.
Right.
The faculty and sometimes the administrators who are responding to the faculty. Does that pose a particular dilemma?
Yes.
For deans of
It
law
poses
schools?
a dilemma on steroids, and what I mean by that is all of what you note about the maybe the innate conservatism of university culture is a dilemma that we face in our law schools. Added to that is the innate conservatism of legal practice. To go back to the guild that you mentioned before, you know, nothing succeeds like success, or if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the basic idea being that law school has succeeded as a profession, and the law school curriculum has looked mostly like it has for 100 years or more. So you contrast it with my colleagues in the business school. Whatever one might say about business schools, and I don't want to sit here and valorize, you know, business school education in America, but the genius of business schools in the last 50, 60 years is they've developed a market for a Master of Business Administration and MBA that is not required by any guild or any state. You don't need an MBA to do anything. So what business schools, and if I sound jealous, it's because I am a little bit jealous. What business schools have been able to develop is innovation that comes from the fact that they're developing a body of curriculum and training that is almost by design keeps up with trends and developments in the modern marketplace. Law schools could use some of that in more modesty, more humility, and more innovation in how they develop their curriculum. So I think getting out of the mindset that basically says, you know, what's good for law students in the 2000 teens is basically what was good for law students in the 1940s would be a big part of the progress that we could make.
Another important constituency is students, alumni, and divide the alumni category into recent alumni and older alumni. And I do that because the challenges of recent alumni are much greater than you've ever seen before. And we should talk a little about that because tuition is going up. Students leave with a lot of debt if they're not on scholarship, and then they're not finding the job. So for recent alumni, they're in a real bind.
Oh, there's no question. So just focusing on the recent alumni.
Yeah.
It's a tale of two groups, to oversimplify a bit. One group are the group of students and recent alumni who you've described who come out, in some cases, with crushing debt, substantial debt. 100,000, 200,000 is not that unusual. And they come out with, while they don't necessarily have regrets about their legal education, they come out often with a fair amount of cynicism and indeed stress that comes from the fact that they have their career choices are in important ways distorted by the fact that they're going to spend a good number of years early in their careers paying off their student debt. So it doesn't mean that they're hostile by any means. Indeed, I spend a lot of time working with their alumni. But it's really a challenge keeping them engaged with the law school given the challenges they're facing in the profession. That's not to mention, you know, social media and all of these issues that have spent now a number of years, folks have spent a number of years ganging up on law schools. I said it's a tale of two alumni. Another group of recent alumni see the value of innovation and greatly appreciate what law schools, not only our law school, but many law schools are doing to change the playbook, to change the script. And they are greatly appreciative of the law schools acknowledging that we have spent all of these years raising tuition, all of these years with existing business models, but are looking to those alumni to make challenges. And I'll say the reason why they're particularly appreciative of that is they're in the real world. They see the kinds of changes that I'm describing. They see the need for developing a different multidisciplinary kinds of skills. They see the need to develop so-called soft skills, leadership skills and the like. And I find them enormously important, this group of recent alumni, in terms of helping us engage our constituency group of students and faculty to the changes that are taking place in the marketplace.
Do you, in a way, almost have to offer courses that expose your students to the changes in the world? You mentioned globalization. You mentioned the way technology is transforming the economy. Are these courses that should be offered in the law school, or should you send your students to other courses on whatever campus you're on to learn about that? Because you can't give them a map for their future, but you can give them tools to think about mapping their future.
I think that's a three-prong strategy, and some might add prongs to that. One is certainly working with folks across campus. One of the great, we talked about the innate conservatism of universities. The other side of that coin is the enormous, robust opportunities presented by being part of a major research university. So we at Northwestern have, as the students here at Berkeley have, opportunities to work across campus with our colleagues in the business school. In our case of our law school, we're right next door to the medical school. We work closely with the engineering school and other departments to really develop a set of skills. We started the first three-year JD MBA program about a dozen years ago, and we have now dozens and dozens of graduates of that program who go on into law and business with those sorts of skills. So the one prong is really developing these cross-campus initiatives and alliances. The second is, you mentioned, is courses within the law school. That, in some sense, is the new frontier, which is developing alongside what I'll call the traditional law school curriculum an enormous amount of skills. So I have some rather off-the-wall ideas in that regard. I think our law students, for example, should have exposure to coding. They're not going to all go out there and do computer coding, but just as law students and undergraduates are expected to learn another language during the time of their undergraduate experience, it wouldn't hurt our students, it would only help them to have some exposure to technology, some exposure to quantitative methods. So yes, we need to bring those courses into the curriculum. Just as an aside, let me say, the challenge there is not so much student receptivity, but faculty bandwidth. And that is, to bring in courses to the law school, it means to bring in a faculty that can actually train them. I'll say third, and very briefly, the third prong is lifelong education and learning. The notion that in these precious 3 years, we can do all that's necessary to train law students to be able to aspire to leadership in the new economy is naive. So we need to engage our alumni, recent alumni and not so recent alumni, to really provide the kind of training and education that begins in earnest once they graduate from law school. So we're not just sending off our students into the brave new world, but we're engaging with alumni in terms of lifelong training. So such programs as, we have a corporate counsel institute that helps young graduates who are working in the corporate sector. There are many examples, but I think that's very important.
Is this an argument for reducing the number of years in law school and taking the third year and sending them out into the world, or at least making the third year more of a year in which you go out, the student goes out into the world and works in a startup, whatever, in a hospital to see what the issues are in medical delivery services and so on?
Well, I'm smiling because, of course, you put your finger on what's an enormous, vigorous debate right now that's in the media and certainly within law schools about the famous question of whether the third year is or is not expendable. And there are very different points of view. And I would summarize my own thinking about that by saying this. I don't think the third year in law school is expendable in the sense that what we're basically doing is either giving them a taste of practical training that they would be better suited to do if they were actually out into practice. Nor do I think that having advanced subjects, what we used to call the law and subjects, law and philosophy, law and economics, law and business, is just window dressing. We only have them for 3 years, and the first year is really a sort of foundational year. So I think at best, the third year can build the bridges between doing substantial academic work. Let's face it, this is probably their last year of higher education, but also significant practical work. It's quite frankly, I think, rather naive and misleading to expect that the third year, if replaced from law school, could just be handed over to large law firms or to judges or to startups to develop the kinds of skills that students need. The economic model doesn't really sustain that. The challenge, though, to come back to the challenge, is whether the third year is justified by its cost. Because some of the attention, and President Obama referred to this, I think, about a year and a half ago, some of the tension about this third year of law school comes from the fact that students are already facing an enormous amount of debt. They might have the skills to take and pass a bar examination after 2 years. So what's the justification to pay another $50,000 and another year out of the workforce in order to take all these wonderful classes in law school?
What happens to affirmative action efforts in the context of these great transitions that are going on?
Well, it's a great question. I think that the larger question of how we continue to commit to diversity in our law schools in the face of these challenges is a very, very hard issue. I don't mean it's hard in terms of where our commitment should lie. I mean it's hard at the level of implementation. So in the era that we're in now, where all the challenges that we've been talking about are being faced, in addition to all of that, there's this overlay of almost paranoia about rankings of law school, about making sure we can sort of elbow our way to the top. With all of those issues that are being faced, and including in that the decline of law school applications, diversity and affirmative action can often be left by the side of the road, and that it can become, as with law firm hiring, an expendable objective and goal. Now, I don't think that that's warranted, but I think that we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that we are not cutting off our nose to spite our face.
I have one question I want to ask you about being president of the association. What sort of things did you learn in that position as you looked at other law schools that hadn't come to your attention in being the leader of Northwestern's law school? Were there any?
It's a wonderful question. Although there were days when I wondered, now why exactly did I undertake this particular hobby, as it were? More of the days I really felt like I learned an enormous amount and hopefully contributed a bit. One of the things I learned is just the enormous diversity of missions of so many of our American law schools and of strategies. I had a sense of what was going on in a number of law schools, or thought I knew a great amount. I had been at a number of law schools, I had led to, but it was really only when I was visiting with so many law schools and working with the faculty and the deans and undertaking this leadership role that I really had a sense of the challenges faced by the wide range and scope of public and private law schools, some that are freestanding, many that are in states that face enormous economic challenges, much worse than places like California and Illinois and Texas. So it gave me a sense of appreciation for how schools were facing these particular challenges. It also gave me a sense of the diversity of faculties of these particular institutions of which we were a part. So I had spent quite a lot of time learning a lot more about the changing role of what I'll say the legal professoriate is like.
Mm-hmm. So I want to, I guess my final question is, will the image of the lawyer remain the same, the positive image? There's also a negative image, but let's talk about the positive image. In an address, I guess, to a graduating class, you summed up nicely. You said that is the ideal of the lawyer. You said, and where there are small issues at stake, that is, you're talking about the mission of the lawyer. And you said where there are small issues at stake, wrongdoing in government, suffering of individuals who require justice, problem solving in the corporate boardroom, new exciting startup businesses to be formed, liberties to be protected, and rights to be enforced. We find that lawyers are there and they are at the ready to deploy their skills, to render their advice, to analyze and advocate, to be the engineers of justice, the protectors of the rule of law. Will that It's a nice statement of
A
the
little
idea.
long. I wish I had actually broken it into maybe 3 sentences, but thank you.
Maybe I didn't read it well, but the point is, do you think that view of the law and the lawyer will endure?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Here's what I would say about that. Certainly, in the context of those remarks, I was speaking to a graduating class of law students, all of whom I want them to feel that they're entering into a great and noble profession, and not have a sense, to come back to something that you asked about at the beginning, that law is just a default, that it's not only an important career but a noble career. Having said that, my answer to whether or not that is still a worthwhile description or depiction of the role of the lawyer is contingent. That is, I believe it ought to be the case, and I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be the case on the following condition, is that we adapt. We in legal education and in the profession adapt to the changes that we're facing. Complacency is no longer justified. The ordinary business model of law schools and law firms are no longer justified. Our ability to remain in our rightful place, by which I don't mean our God-given place, but I mean our rightful place as the guarantor of individual liberty, as the protector of the wise constraints that make men free, and all of that, will very much be dependent on our ability to navigate some real challenges, to work with other professions, and to provide the kinds of skills and training and education that will enable young lawyers in particular to be able to adapt to this tsunami of changes that are facing not only the legal profession, but the economy. And if we can do that, I'm quite bullish, as the saying goes, on the ability of legal education to continue to work for another 100 years, as it has for the past 100 years, as really an ennobling educational endeavor for folks in this new world.
Well, on that positive note, Dean Rodriguez, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be on our program.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.